One question, two views. You decide.
You know, the whole debate really boils down to this one central question. What is the Sumerian King List? Is it a genuine good faith attempt to record history? Or is it a really cleverly calculated political tool? Let's dive into the evidence.
So on one side, you have scholars who argue the list preserves authentic historical memory, something that was carefully compiled from even older sources. But on the other side, there's the view that the list deliberately reshapes the past, all to grant political legitimacy to a new dynasty. So which one is it? To really figure that out, we have to ask an even more specific question.
In this explainer, we're really going to focus on how the list was actually preserved. Was it a faithful merger of older records, or was it a deliberate political construction right from the very beginning?
All right, to get our heads around this, we're going to look at three key arguments. First, how the list was put together from its original sources. Second, the authenticity of its dynasty order. And third, how the text was passed down and edited over time.
So let's jump right in with our first argument, how the list was composed. I mean, think about it. How do you take multiple, completely independent histories and stitch them together into one single story?
The core disagreement here is all about the author's intent. Was the person who created the King List a careful historian, just trying their best to integrate authentic city records? Or were they more of a political strategist, deliberately building a narrative to serve a very specific agenda?
Okay, so view 1 suggests the author was basically an archivist. They had these separate king lists from cities like Kish and Uruk, and their whole job was just to combine them. The key, according to this view, is that they did it with a strict bookkeeping mentality. They tried to preserve everything, even the little details that actually contradicted their main idea that only one city could rule at a time.
And this is where the two views just completely collide. View 1 says, look, the inconsistencies, like evidence of dynasties ruling at the same time, are actually proof of authenticity. A forger would have cleaned all that up, right? A faithful historian preserves the messy truth. But view 2 points to what's missing. We know from other sources about important kings who are just gone from the list. They say these are strategic omissions, totally designed to create a neat linear story that just so happens to legitimize the new Isin dynasty.
Now, this whole idea of a single, clean line of kings brings us right to the second major argument, the order of the dynasties themselves. Is the list's neat, one after the other sequence historically accurate? And again, we see this fundamental conflict. View 1 argues that, yeah, it's not perfect, but the list sequence does capture the general flow of history. You know, which cities were dominant at which times. But for view 2, this linear sequence isn't just a simplification. It's a fundamental distortion. It's an ideological move meant to impose a false sense of order on what was a much more chaotic reality. And here's the core evidence from view 2. They point to other ancient texts, like the Widener Chronicle, which clearly show that dynasties listed one after another in the king list were actually ruling at the same time. Uruk and Nagash, for example, were big-time rival powers. The reality, they argue, wasn't some clean relay race of power, but a much more complex web of overlapping city-states all vying for control.
So how does V1 respond to that? Well, they argue the overlaps aren't actually hidden. An informed ancient reader could look at the reign lengths and other details and spot the complexities. They say the linear format was just for clarity, but the raw data for a more complicated picture was preserved, showing respect for tradition. View 2 rejects this completely. They say the entire point of the structure was to create that false appearance of orderly succession. It was a powerful piece of propaganda for the Isin dynasty to claim it was the legitimate heir to a single, unbroken line of kingship.
Okay, this brings us to our final argument, editorial transmission and redaction. This is all about what happened after the list was first created. How is it copied, how is it changed, and how is it passed down through the centuries?
This slide really lays out the two opposing models. For view 1, transmission was a process of preservation. Scribes would faithfully copy an authoritative text, maybe updated with the current king, but they always kept the core structure intact. For view 2, though, transmission was an act of political manipulation. A new power would seize control, reshape history to legitimize its own rule, and then actively suppress any other competing versions of the past.
A key battleground here is the list's opening section. You know, the mythological pre-flood kings with the crazy long reigns. View 1 sees this as a pretty transparent addition. Scribes knew there was a big gap in their history, so they just filled it with myths, clearly marking the shift with the story of the Great Flood. But View 2 argues this was a calculated ideological move by Isin. By inserting a mythological origin story, they framed their own rise to power after the collapse of the Earth III dynasty as a kind of cosmic reboot, giving them legitimacy that stretched all the way back to the dawn of time.
So why do the surviving copies of the King List actually differ from one another? View 1 says this is just a natural result of the copying process over hundreds of years. Small errors, scribal updates to an authoritative text. View 2, on the other hand, sees these variations as evidence of an ideological war. They argue different cities and dynasties created their own competing versions of the list to promote their own importance. And the version we have today is simply the one that won out politically.
All right, so after looking at how the list was composed, how it was ordered, and how it was transmitted, let's just quickly recap the two competing interpretations we've explored.
So let's pull it all together. When it comes to composition, was it a faithful merger or was it a deliberate selection of material? For the order, does it preserve general history or does it impose a false narrative? And for transmission, was it careful preservation and updating or was it systematic political revision? This is really the core of the debate.
So, you've heard the evidence on both sides of this ancient puzzle.
And as always, we are not here to tell you what to think. The real question is, which story does the evidence tell you?
Is the Sumerian King List a priceless historical record, something carefully pieced together and preserved? Or is it a masterful piece of propaganda, a story constructed to cement power? A historical record or a political construction? Now it's your turn to decide.
So which argument do you find more compelling? Let us know your take down in the comments below. And hey, if there's another historical puzzle you'd like us to explain, be sure to mention it.